think we lost. A very good afternoon from the Asian Confluence, and I want to welcome you to this webinar. And over to you, Volker, to make the introduction.
Thank you, Savia. Yes, also welcome from my side, from Hans Seidel Foundation, to our webinar, Federal Responses to Climate Change, Perspectives from India. You have just met our host, Sabyasachi Datta, the Director of Asian Confluence. I'm the Country Director of Hans Seidel Foundation India, Volker Lennart Blann, and I'm co-hosting today. Most of you know Asian Confluence and Hans Seidel Foundation most likely from our extensive work on water governance and water federalism, both in India as well as in the region of South Asia. Water federalism is a highly politicized and very interesting aspect to talk about. So I'm quite excited that we can have an event today with two distinguished experts on specifically this topic. If you want to know more generally about Asian Confluence or Hans Seidel Foundation India, what we do and what other programs we're offering, please see our social media channels or check out our homepages. They're on the invitation, and we will also show them later on again. Currently, this live stream is on Facebook and also on YouTube. Wherever you are watching us right now, you can use the chat box there to ask questions. You can ask questions anytime. The format will be a conversation among our experts for the next 40 to 50 minutes, followed by a Q&A. And I think without any further ado, I would just like to introduce our speakers for today. Dr. Sharat Chandra Lele is the Distinguished Fellow in Environmental Policy and Governance at the Ashoka Trust for Research in Ecology and Environment, or short ATRE, in Bangalore. He's an expert on sustainable development, and his research encompasses institutional, economic, ecological, and technological issues in forest, energy, and water resources management. He went to the University of California, Berkeley, where he got his PhD in energy and resources. He also spent a year at the Pacific Institute for Studies in Development, Environment, and Security in Oakland, and another year in Harvard at the Department for Forest Research before he returned to Bangalore. Today in Bangalore, he is, I think, to most of you, all of you, known for his position, his major position at ATRE. I think ATRE is now one of the most important research think tanks in environmental studies in India. And Dr. Lele is on government committees, he's on task forces for various environmental issues, not only to his focus topics that I mentioned in the beginning. So thank you very much for joining us, Dr. Lele. Sanjay Upadhyay, he's the Managing Director for the Enviro Defense, Legal Defense Group. He is an environmental lawyer, and that alone is already quite special in India. And he focuses on forest governance. He already worked with the World Wildlife Fund in the past, but then he became the founder in 1999 of India's first environmental law firm, which is called Enviro Legal Defense Firm. So he sits in New Delhi, where he remains a managing partner for the Enviro Legal Defense Firm, but he's also an advocate at the Supreme Court of India. So he continues to fight court cases and negotiates with government, state and central governments on a range of forest issues. He is also a member of the Forest Governance Learning Group. In this learning group, there are 10 countries involved all across the world, mostly in Africa and Asia, and the group focuses on environmental issues, and they are specifically concerning forests. Both of his organizations, the Enviro Defense and Forest Governance Learning Group, are extremely active today, thanks to Sanjay Upadhyay. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Volker.
Thank you, Volker.
So I would like to dive right into the topic, since I was quite excited to start this conversation, since this is a topic that Hans Seidel Foundation and Asian Confluence have been working on for some years now. Now, climate change is something that affects all of us and can be seen, especially in India, on the ground. Every farmer can tell you about climate change experiences. But we have the most responses to climate change that we hear about are the ones on national level or even international level, carbon emission reduction, on the Paris Agreement, to say is important to mention here. There are many national policies, but one wonders if climate change is such a specifically local issue, wouldn't be also lower levels of governance be more effective in tackling this issue? And the question to both of you would be, in this today's tendency of centralization in India's governance, how do you see India's response to climate change adaptation or mitigation as far as the policy space is concerned? And which level do you think, or which response would be the most effective ones to help India in mitigating the climate change? Maybe Dr. Lele, if you would like to go first.
Sure. Thanks, Volker, again for a very generous, probably over-generous introduction. And it's a pleasure to be here talking with you, with Sanjay and with Shabya on this interesting question, because it covers four different intersecting areas: climate change, the idea of federalism, and questions of forests and water as sectors. And so it's a really complicated topic that we hope in the next maybe hour and a half, we can at least make some headway in unpacking some of the complexities and dimensions of this question. I think to begin with, it's important to recognize that all said and done, climate change is a global phenomenon, and it's global not only in its manifestations but also in its origins, because CO2 greenhouse gas emissions anywhere, whether it's CO2 or methane or anything else, will lead to climate change across the globe. There's no way to say that this ton of carbon dioxide here has only caused, let's say, melting of glaciers in the Himalayas and not responsible for the melting of the Antarctic or the sea level rise in New York. So it is a truly global phenomenon in the sense both the origins are global. Anywhere you have GHG emissions, they are contributing to climate change, and the impacts are also global. And at the same time, it's also differentiated. So this whole discussion about differentiated as a code word for multiple reasons, because the emissions didn't happen uniformly across the globe over history. They happened mostly in the developed world, and in fact, the developed world is developed because of the emissions that they have produced, and the developing world, in a sense, is catching up on the emissions front over the last few decades, but still far behind if you look at a per capita calculus. They are also differentiated in terms of impacts. Who will face those impacts? Small island states will go down, very quickly, submerged by sea level rise. But the same is not true for a landlocked country, for instance, and a temperate country or a Arctic Circle country like parts of Russia might actually benefit from the warming and the thawing of the permafrost. So there's a whole range of kinds of impacts and location of those impacts. Who will feel the most? Who is most vulnerable in the sense, given their economic profile and situation? So it's a common but differentiated problem. It's a global commons and at the same time differentiated in its origin and its impacts. Having said that, given that it's a global problem, it's not surprising that a lot of focus of the climate question has been on international negotiations. And whether the Paris Accord is only the latest of a whole series that started way back, and we had the Kyoto Protocol in between that, and so on and so forth, right? So it was seen as an international issue for good reasons. It is an international issue. The challenge is to then trace the links between that international dimension and the national, state, and local dimensions. And at one level, as you said, you talk to any farmer, and they will tell you that they are experiencing climate change on a daily basis. In India, especially, the kinds of shifts that people are seeing, the kinds of vagaries of the weather that people are seeing. The question, therefore, is how do you make the link? And here again, we need to, I think, separate mitigation and adaptation. The question of what should we be doing towards climate change mitigation is different from what should we be doing in terms of, given that some amount of climate change is absolutely inevitable, even if we somehow, and the Paris Accord is not very hopeful in that direction, but somehow manage to avoid runaway climate change, avoid 4 degrees or its equivalent impacts, and we stay under 2 degrees, let us say, but that's still a huge amount of change. And so the question of adapting to those changes while at the same time trying to mitigate is a really challenging and complicated question. But we should separate these two out. And in the context of, let's say, forests and water, the two sectors that we are going to try to focus on today, I think we can see that the water sector is primarily where you are facing climate change to which you have to adapt. Sorry, the water sector by itself does not cause climate change, except to the small extent that there are arguments about large dams, for example, producing greenhouse gases because they have submerged forests and the forest vegetation is decayed in an anaerobic manner in parts of Brazil and so on. But by and large, the water sector is not contributing greenhouse gases. It's facing the consequences. The forest sector is more complicated. It's both seen as a contributor. If you have deforestation, then you obviously you have produced greenhouse gases, um, and at the same time, it can also be a sequester. It can sequester carbon. Therefore, it can help you in mitigation. The forest sector will also have to adapt because you might have situations where species that have adapted to a certain kind of climate are no longer viable in the new climate. So there's a whole adaptation question around the forest sector also. So these are kind of the dimensions that we need to look at, and clearly the international commitments are themselves falling way far short of any reasonable goal that we would say we need to have in terms of avoiding runaway climate change. If you add up all the Paris commitments, they do not add up to that kind of reduction. They are both inequitable and insufficient in terms of its effect. But translating those international commitments on mitigation here, the commitments are primarily about mitigation to the national, provincial, and then the local level is a huge challenge. And the challenge varies again by the sector. But I'll put out one sort of proposition just for discussion, is that because climate change is a global issue, and it starts, therefore all the discussion starts with the issue of international negotiations and then international commitments. uh, these negotiations are done by the national government, and implementation is also then seen as being the national government's prerogative, or the first start has to be given by the national government. And therefore, as a proposition, I would say uh, climate change related action tends to re-centralize control with the central government in a country, away from the state governments and away from the local tiers of government. That's just a proposition that we could discuss at greater length.
Sorry, can you come back again on that, Sharad? I just missed on that. Sorry.
Yes, I was saying that as a proposition, I would like to suggest the possibility that because climate change starts with international negotiations, then you set targets there, then you work your way downwards. So inevitably, the first step is taken by the national government within a country on what is to be done, and therefore climate change has a tendency to re-centralize governance in both the forest and the water sectors into the hands of the national government. And maybe we could discuss, whether that's true, whether it's more complicated than that, and so on.
Well, quite interesting. I would like to know what Mr. Upadhyay says to this.
Certainly Sharad is far into this, rigorously, I would say. Lawyers are a community who can speak on anything without even a brief sometimes. So we are not really experts. What we normally experience is what's happening around us. And I look at the climate debate in three different ways. There are climate advocates, there are climate skeptics, and there are climate ignorance or indifferent community. I probably belong to the third one, or rather, my fraternity sort of come from the third indifferent, ignorant sort of community. But when you look at, and there's a reason for that. When you look at, the entire global debate on climate change, or when you see the Paris Agreement and the kind of conversations, and then how does India respond to it through its nationally determined contributions, etc. What we see is those instruments are very soft instruments. When you look at it as a lawyer, you find these instruments very lofty in terms of principles, but when it actually comes to the ground in terms of implementation, you find that there is a very loose framework. You end up having an action plan on climate change, which is, of course, nationally driven by the Prime Minister's office. So it gets a very good traction at a political level. But when it comes to the actual delivery and the binding nature of that instrument, that is where the problem begins. So even if it is centralized, and I think Sharad is rightly pointing out that most of these international debates start centrally. But the response centrally again is a problematic thing, because it often becomes only a loose instrument, like an action plan, and then we call different names. We have missions, we have 8 missions, for example. But how are these missions binding when you get it to a state context, or a district context, or a village context? So I think that is some of the that's the first challenge. In India, if you look at the Constitution, for example, we have Article 253, which, if you use that in the international agreements, and if you make that binding, then that is the constitutional provision you normally have to use. But I haven't seen climate change frameworks being strengthened by Article 253 of the Constitution, for example, because that makes it a little more binding and a little more serious. Otherwise, I consider a lot of this as posturing, and I'm not using it loosely, in the largest sense of the word. Because what happens internationally when you talk about these instruments, and what happens nationally, are two different things. And you hear a lot about how we are focusing on renewable energy, especially solar now with the new governance system, how we are trying to lower tariffs, how we are trying to advance electric mobility, how we are trying to set temperatures of air conditioners, how we are mitigating air pollution. Um, and I was surprised. I saw a few articles, and it was written that the new instruments like the EIA 2020 is also an instrument to mitigate climate change by increasing the role of private players. I mean, I'm not opposed to private players, but how do you really do that? We have a commitment of, I believe, additional carbon sink by 2.5 to 3 billion tons by additional tree and forest cover by 2030. And for that, again, the role of private players have been highlighted. We all know how the Green India mission is functioning currently. So, if you see the larger academic sort of debate, or the pointers that you see, which is coming nationally, uh, I feel there is a lot that needs to be done, uh, and I think the question that you asked, Volker, in the beginning, that centralized response may be a necessity, but I think the real challenge is how do you get it to the ground. And if you look at the two sectoral topics that you're talking about, both have very, not just cross-statal or multi-statal impacts, but also multi-country. I mean, if you're talking about a landscape of biodiversity, for example, and its impact on climate change, we recently were working with EC Mode on this, for example, in the Far East landscape. And you find that what you do in India has an impact in Burma or Myanmar. What China does has an impact on India. And when you go further down to Bangladesh, or north towards Bhutan, so it is no more just a national issue, or just a statal issue. In fact, in this case, even states have an impact on a different country. So I think the challenges are becoming very, very acute. And our legal frameworks, or our policy frameworks, I don't think necessarily addresses that. So to me, as a policy person or a legal person, you need more certainty in the framework itself. We have a lot of science, but unless you get the policy frame right, unless you get the legislative frame right, there'll be little headway. And I think that is, to me, the first big challenge, which I want also, maybe Sharad to react on.
Then I would ask the question as a follow-up question to both of you, actually, if you see any form of change in agreements between the center and the states, or change in the coordination framework between center and states that would be necessary in order to increase the overall effectiveness on climate change adaptation or mitigation.
So I'd like to make a distinction again between adaptation and mitigation here, because when you think about it, the activities or the kinds of investments or the kinds of changes that are required to, let's say, make a farmer in Karnataka, slightly more adapted to imminent climate change, which might mean reduced rainfall in the Western Ghats and increased but highly erratic rainfall in the Eastern Plains, is very different from the kind of efforts and activities you would have to implement in the Himalayas, for instance, to get the farmers there to become slightly more resilient to climate change, right? So, to me, adaptation is very much a local issue. It's not even a state issue. I mean, a state government can only do so much, and unless it really works in a decentralized manner at a district and sub-district level, it's just going to roll out these very simplified programs, and or it is going to then impose, bigger dams to solve water problems across a large area kind of a response. So I think adaptation should be seen as a very localized response, because climate change will manifest in very different ways, even within a single state. Karnataka is a classic example where the coastal, the Western Ghats, and the Eastern Plains will see very different implications of climate change. So responses have to be highly localized. So I think there it's really not a whole lot that the center should be doing other than facilitating, providing funding, and so on. And this, in a sense, reflects our history of a very non-federal or poorly federal kind of structure, right? I mean, as it is, we cannot call ourselves a federal country. We are a unitary scheme of government, a lot of subjects in the joint list. And in the joint list, also, the centers have far exceeded their powers in terms of what they should be doing, even from the constitutional perspective. What are they actually allowed to do, and what they do in practice? As a recent article by Ajit Ranade, an economist, points out, that even this centrally sponsored schemes, where the central government takes tax money, puts it into these plans, or now, of course, plans have been done away with, and through that into these centrally sponsored schemes, by which to, in a sense, tweak or incentivize state governments to uh, do certain kinds of activities, is actually a bit of a violation of the idea of federalism. If they want to give money to states, they should give their states their share of money. The share of money has actually been dwindling, or it's been tweaked to look bigger, but actually a smaller share of the pie, and so on. And it's a pretty small share. It's 30 to 40% of the total revenues of the central government. And then some others are doled out through this kind of plan mechanism. So I think we are a unitary government. We have not been federal. If we are federalism, or whatever, the power of the center versus the state has only increased over the years, and that's something to be really concerned about as we go along, because you can't run such a complicated country without having much more decentralized democracy. In the context of adaptation, I think definitely we need to think of it in decentralized ways. And even in the context of, say, mitigation through the forest sector. Sanjay rightly mentioned the goal, the commitments made. So I was going to say, Sanjay, that you're right in saying that we really don't have, hugely binding commitments in the Paris Accord. The language is very soft and so on. But if you look at even the three commitments that we made, one was about reducing the energy intensity of GDP. The other is increasing the share of renewable energy in our total installed electricity capacity to 40%. And the third is commitments to sequester in the forest sector, right? Of these three, the first two are really very notional. I mean, if you just do a few things, the targets are so soft, and if you just do a few things, you're already there. I mean, our commitments are, I think, till 2030, if I'm not mistaken. We are already getting towards those numbers, because the government knew beforehand that they were, headed in that direction. The forest sector is the one where the commitment is a big commitment, and it's not going to be implementable unless the government sorts out the perennial question that Sanjay and I have been working on in the forest sector for the last, I don't know, 30 years, since 1990, which is, who owns the forest? How do you do sequestration on a piece of land without saying who owns that, who owns or who has the right to manage that piece of land, and decide whether to plant trees or to cut them down? And the tussle between the forest departments and local communities is a well-known, well-documented tussle that's been going on ever since the British period. And we haven't resolved that problem. So what actually this commitment does is that it creates the possibility of more funds going into the forest department's hands. It creates the possibility of the forest department becoming more hectoring, more dominant, by saying, now we have to deliver on the carbon goals, so you better listen to us and do what we say. using carbon as another argument for their power and control. And they've been doing that. I mean, you should have seen the amount of literature that the Ministry of Environment, the forestry side of it, produced even before Paris on this whole idea of RED plus. The idea that we can sequester carbon and gain credits for that. Huge literature. We are RED ready. We are RED plus ready. We are, all the jargon and all the claims about monitoring. We will do remote sensing and we will estimate carbon across the country and estimate change every year, and all this kind of very top down, very technocratic kind of stuff, without understanding the ground realities, or willingly ignoring the ground reality of, you cannot control people from entering a forest which they have been using customary for a long time, or if you do, it comes at a huge social cost. And how are you going to be talking about carbon sequestration, which could involve denying people even further? You are now saying this tree cannot be cut because it is sequestering carbon for somebody in New York, right? Who's paid for it, maybe through the RED plus mechanism or something like that. So that's a really, that's again very closely intertwined with the question of centralized versus decentralized governance in the forest sector. And if you have a decentralized vision of forest governance, then you're going to have to approach that whole issue very differently as to what is feasible, what is possible in terms of these commitments. Sanjay?
So, Sharad, if I just have to take that debate further on the forestry question, I mean, we have this compensated conservation approach as a principle, right? And we've been trying to get some money for that. At the same time, Indian government always says that we don't really need the money. We have the NPV money, we have the Campa money. We keep talking about 55,000 crores, 60,000 crores. I, by the way, call it blood money because it's actually diverting pristine forest and then talking about meeting your Green India mission targets. And given the RED plus, the way it has panned out, I mean, I don't know enough field experiences, but whatever little I hear, and I've seen it in other Southeast Asian countries, and it was very fascinating to see in Indonesia and Cambodia through the Asia Forestry Network, I remember. And people were given this absolute rosy picture that next month you'll be getting this huge amount of dollars, and you just have to do little basic calculations and it'll be ready. And however RED ready or RED plus ready we may be claiming to be there, I don't think we are anywhere close to that. And what do you think is the real cause? I mean, as a person who's been seeing this for so long.
I mean, I think one thing I should clarify is that, in fact, the discourse has changed. You're right, as you rightly pointed out, somewhere around the Paris Accord period, the government realized that by then it was sitting with 40,000 crores of Campa money. Today it is 60,000 crores of Campa money. So the government realized that they really don't need external RED plus money to do afforestation activities per se, as far as the financing is concerned. And so they, if you see what they've done in Paris, in a sense, they have ditched RED plus completely, because now you have made a voluntary commitment to sequester 2.5 or 3 gigatons of CO2 equivalent in your forests. Now, if it's voluntary, then you can't be asking for money for that voluntary commitment, right? So they've given up on the idea that you'll get external money for RED plus, and they're they sounded confident, at least in Paris, that they would use internal sources, and Campa is the big source, to do this stuff. Now, if you look at the reality, even the government's own the national report that they submit every so many years to UNFCCC, the numbers are all over the place in terms of the forests are actually sequestering or not sequestering. And post Paris, that the report that went to UNFCCC, they revised it some 2 or 3 times, because it's all a numbers game. Nobody can really pin you down on that, but some of the claims they were making were really shocking. So and UNFCCC actually rejected their initial estimates, saying we don't really believe these numbers of grand kind of estimates of carbon sequestration. So I think there might now be a realization that it's not going to be so easy to get there. I hope there is a realization that maybe it was a silly idea to begin with, to commit on carbon sequestration in the forest sector, a sector where the inhabitants are either those who cannot speak for themselves at all, that is the wildlife and biodiversity, or those who are the weakest and most marginalized sections of our community. and imposing a sequestration requirement on them is depriving them of either biodiversity or livelihoods, or both, right? And because then you can just plant eucalyptus all over the place and say, as long as you don't cut it, you're sequestered carbon, and that would be a big disaster for everybody else who's associated with that landscape. And I hope there is a bit of a realization not only that it's difficult, but that it is perhaps foolish to put carbon right on top. But unfortunately, I'm not so sure about that, because the last time I heard the what is it, the Director General of Forests, who's a sort of top forester in the country, speak at two different public occasions where he said we are revising the national forest policy, and the top two objectives of the national forest policy are going to be carbon and water. So carbon sequestration and water conservation as the two main goals of forest policy. And both are based upon either, well, in the first case, I think wrong social science, and in the second case, wrong natural science. But that's something we can talk about if you have the time.
Yeah, it's in the back burner right now.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the things that keeps bothering me in this debate of climate change versus the whole federalism debate. Constitutionally speaking, you'll always find that we've been always talking about cooperative federalism. Where there is this very comfortable state aiding the center and vice versa, and that is the constitutional goal. But I was reading somewhere that the latest is the competitive federalism. That means there is always this bit of a one-upmanship, and with the now the recent tax structures, etc., and the way the politics play out, it's quite challenging. And when you look at the water sector, for example, all the water tribunals that you see, the sharing of waters, and the impact of taking a water, and what is the riparian right that you impact of the downstream state. I mean, these debates are becoming increasingly contentious. And when you add the climate impact to that particular resource, then it gets even more complicated. And what I find as a lawyer is that we still don't have those sophisticated instruments to factor in these changes which are happening, which are so obvious. I mean, if you look at any instrument, for example, if you're looking at a coastal space, and you look at your coastal regulation zone notification, which for God's sake, I don't know why it is still a notification. From 1991 onwards, we are still in 2020 and we still have one notification, which means it's a subordinate legislation having, which can be tweaked anytime. I think 39 times was the last count. EIA notification, again, a notification, changed about 51 times since 1994. So the kind of instruments we have, and this is very important, because on a day-to-day basis, when you see a particular impact on environment, whether it's on the forest sector, on the water sector, or a coastal space, or any other, on groundwater, these are the instruments you use, and the forums that we have. For example, the latest one we have, which is the National Green Tribunal. I mean, if you go to a National Green Tribunal talking about climate liability, or what will be the impact and who actually is responsible, you will get a very cold response that, we are bound by this section 14, which is it a substantial question of environment, or we are bound by this appealable provision of, what is your clearance against which you're coming. And they just brush away with one stroke of pen that this is not their domain at all. And we were very surprised, because constitutional courts are not taking up these matters, because they feel that there is a specialist tribunal now to look into this. The tribunal itself is filled with people who are just forestry experts right now. So they don't have the bandwidth of looking at these debates at all. And of course, honorable judges are not even trained in this arena. So for people who are really interested in taking up this cause to a bigger audience, to get more binding instruments in place, it's a total closed door for us. And I don't know how to crack this yet, because anytime you go, I mean, recently we went on a whole debate of FGD, the flue gas desulfurization method that is now being mandated in the thermal power plant, saying that this is more harmful in terms of cost and the kind of energy you will use than a regular mitigation measure. And all we got to know was this is a policy issue, go back to the ministry. And so we are finding a big deadlock in the judicial space to debate these issues. I mean, if you go to the Supreme Court on Article 32, you will probably never get a debate going because you're so filled with we have done this, we have done planning, we have done missions, we are following the targets. So there is no really cause of action, that you can pinpoint, and we all know the kind of impacts that we are seeing. So that is another challenge that I find. I mean, we don't have a climate law framework. We have not really thought through a climate change, let's say a mitigation or adaptation authority that we can. It's not that we don't have the spaces in the law, but we are not using those spaces at all, and we are still in that very colonial eminent domain, you know, criminal liability sort of framework.
Mm,
So
mm,
there is the third element, apart from the eminent domain and the criminal liability principle, whether we can get into that space of incentives and a different framework that may be required for the issues or the challenges of climate change. We are still stuck with the eminent domain and the criminal liability principle. I think we have to really move towards incentive-based mechanisms and other methods to make these instruments more useful. I don't know. I mean, these are the things that I really grapple with at the moment.
So Sanjay, if I could, Volker, if I could just jump in with a question for Sanjay, because I'm really glad that you raised this question about a legal
Sure.
framework for climate change mitigation, or things like that. Uh, I think so. I was thinking about what is an analogy or an example where the courts have taken it up, and there's the U.S. example where the U.S. Supreme Court did rule that, or maybe it was actually a federal court that ruled that the U.S. EPA was empowered to make rules about CO2 emissions under the Environmental Protection Act, because CO2 was a pollutant, and so the EPA did have powers to make regulations. So there was a big victory in the US context, because the government has been a climate denier or refusing to take on any binding commitments and so on. So in that context, the courts did play an important role, right? Now, if you come to the Indian context, unlike other environmental problems where, at least in the past, the courts had to push the states to do something, you could argue that the Indian government has. There are two challenges here, right? One, uh, how do you frame a climate law for a problem where the origins of the problem may not even be within India? As a sovereign country, we can only frame laws which apply to India.
Yeah.
We cannot frame laws or even have Supreme Court judgments which say, let's put the US president in prison because they have emitted too much CO2. You can't do that, right? Even if you have a very activist Supreme Court, which we don't anyway. So then so there are these two dimensions. One, it's an international problem or rather global problem, which means that the origins of the insult or the origins of the liability are outside, number one, and therefore you don't have any powers over that. And secondly, you might say that yes, there is no climate law, uh, but the state has taken enough executive decisions to it's gone and made some Paris Agreement commitments, and it's gone ahead and sought to implement those through various incentives for renewable energy, etc., etc. So if it's meeting its Paris commitments, then it's doing its job. Vis-a-vis, if you were to say Article 21, right to life, right to environment, I am living in a place where 50 meters from my house there's an extremely polluted river. So I could go to the court and say the state's responsibility is to provide a clean environment, and this river is extremely polluted by 50 different studies that are out there, and so the state is liable to do something about it, right? Because that's my right to a clean environment. But there, the insult is local. The origin of the pollution is within 20 kilometers of where I am, and the state has laws but has not implemented them. In a few cases, may not have the laws. And I'm thinking that this climate change problem is tricky for both these reasons. That whatever they have already committed, they're doing. So what would you do? Let's say you went to court on a climate issue. What would you even want the court to do?
So the way I look at it, one is whether what you are committing to an international forum,
Hmm.
whether that itself is binding on you nationally or not.
Hmm.
So it's a national debate of what you have what you've committed outside the country. So my first focus, and that's what perhaps the Leghari judgment does in Pakistan. I mean, a dear friend of mine who's now in the Supreme Court, Justice Mansoor Ali Shah, and he's learned the ropes, from friends like us. And after he became a judge, he was very active, and suddenly he has now ruled that the climate action plan has to be a binding instrument. So I think we have to take steps that whether what we are saying, let's say this 8 missions that we have, the principles that are there in those 8 missions, are we really following it just as a matter of policy, or is it binding on us? So I think something to that effect makes our national commitment a little more stronger compared to what we are telling the world. I mean, we know the debate between, let's say, a forest and a tree cover, and we kind of expand our numbers, and we all know the debate, uh, that it is absolutely a fudged figure in some sense when we are telling the world that we are increasing our forest and tree cover, but it is essentially, it's the tree cover which may be increasing a bit, but we are losing pristine forest. So nobody is doing that disaggregation here. So I think those are things that, when we commit to the world, we can make it nationally binding. So for me, if we can even do that, I mean, everybody wants to hang the US president, but I'm not that interested right now. We are more interested in perhaps taking, the national commitments more seriously. And if we can even do that through our court system, and I'm not talking about local problems, because I mean, we are such a huge country that there are impacts. I mean, we are talking about, for example, this whole stubble burning, which is the most recent thing in air pollution. And one of the debates is whether you should incentivize a farmer over and above the minimum support price that he or she gets, to not burn the stubble. And there are
Hmm.
two clear thoughts that, why should you give a perverse incentive to a set of farmers? Because again, farmers are not uniform across the country. A farmer in Punjab is not a farmer in Vidarbha or a farmer in Odisha. So we don't disaggregate sometimes. So there are enough evidences of climate impacts within the big nation like ours. So if we can even get to a point where we have strengthened the commitments that we have made globally, I think that's a good battle won to begin with. So I would go by that, for starters.
Then let me follow you up on that directly, since you've made that point twice now that we need to have a legally binding framework in place. But let's say we have that in place, which is tied to the national commitments of India. How can you hold then the actors on state level or local level in India responsible to fulfill the commitments that were made on the national level?
So if you look at Supreme Court judgments, and that's why I keep talking about seeds of climate justice, if you will. If you look at our basic principles, like principle or the precautionary principle that we have, or the polluter pays principle that we have, or the principle of sustainable development, or the principle of intergenerational equity, these are all now part of Article 21, of our constitution, which means it's our fundamental right to enforce either of these principles. The challenge really is that when you take a context of a visible climate impact, or through a state actor, or through a federal actor, can we bring in these principles and make it operational on the ground or not? I think that is the real challenge, because today principles are not translatable for want of a better word, to real action. So, we may, for example, uh, how do you assess damage? This is a huge challenge today. If you look at the Central Pollution Control Board's formula of what is the principle of assessing damage, it's absolutely bizarre, because a company which is set up for 4 lakhs has to pay 25 lakhs suddenly for what they have done because of that calculation, not necessarily because of the actual assessment of damage. So I think we have to really have very sophisticated instruments, and I'm not the competent person to talk about it, to actually assess damages. And there are tools available that we can use rather than one simple formula of so many number of days versus consent condition violation into the location factor and bang 600 crores. It doesn't work because you got to stay in the Supreme Court. And it just sounds, makes good news, but then that's it, it ends there. So I think we have to really get into and pierce that wheel and get into real assessment of damages, and then it is possible to make it little more binding.
So I'd like to add to that, but before I do want to make a small detour and say, Sanjay, that if you want to get into the issue of binding commitments and holding the government to binding commitments, I would only want to do it in the adaptation space and not in the mitigation space. And the reason is the mitigation, for example, NDC 3, which is about sequestering carbon in the forest sector, is such a crazy commitment to begin with that I don't want the courts to hold the government to it. Because it is a really bad commitment, and it's a very because the sequestration angle is a very monodimensional angle. You're doing it in a space where forests are a classic example of a multiple benefits ecosystem, and these are competing benefits. If you only go for sequestration, you might lose the other benefits. If you only go for, let's say, biodiversity, you get a low level of sequestration. If you go for livelihoods, you get a little bit of low levels on both of the other two fronts. So it's a really a space of competing interests, and you do not want to get that complexity to be funneled through this one-dimensional understanding of forests as we have made these international, because we have made international commitments on CBD also. We have made international commitments on indigenous people's rights also. We have made commitments on for the forest sector, otherwise livelihoods also. So I feel if you say the climate commitment is binding, then we might end up in a bit of a soup. I'd love to see, however, the idea that you mentioned about the precautionary principle expanded to include climate change. And an example would be the water sector, for example, that you've got, let's say, the Kaveri Tribunal Award for sharing of waters on the Kaveri. We know that even in the absence of climate change, the award is faulty in the sense it does not give you the solution in a drought year. It does not tell you how to scale down the allotments of water made in a drought year, because the allocations have been made for a normal year, and it just has some weak language about what is to be done in a subnormal year, but does not have very clear clarity on that at all, how to scale it down to a bad year, right? Now you introduce the dimension of climate change, right? And as I said, some predictions, and we are seeing some of those symptoms already, that the source catchment for the Kaveri, which is the Western Ghats, which is the big source of the water in the Kaveri, will see declines in the rainfall, possibly, or might see just more wild fluctuations, some crazily high years and some really low years, right? So at least the variability in the Kaveri basin is definitely going to go up. Possibly there could be a secular decline in the flows in the Kaveri. Now, the precautionary principle then tells us that your accord or the award given by the tribunal needed to factor in the possibility that climate change will further mess up these calculations, which they haven't done. They haven't even done it for normal fluctuations. So climate change ka to baat hi chodo, right? So one should actually take the tribunal to court, to the Supreme Court, and saying, as per the precautionary principle interpretation of Article 21, this award needs to be modified to make it much more conservative, not allocate all the water, keep a 20-30% buffer, because that buffer may simply may disappear in a bad year altogether. So you shouldn't be allocating 100% of the water. Right now they have allocated 95%, or even more than that. Just about 5 TMC of water that they allow to go to the ocean, which is, from an ecological perspective, itself a problem, that you treat all water going to the ocean as waste. It's a 5 TMC is hardly a meaningful kind of environmental flow. That apart, you have the uncertainty introduced by climate change. You might want to actually take them to court, saying you need to modify this award to bring in a much stronger precautionary principle approach there, because you're going to see much greater fluctuations, right?
That gives me an idea to look into the current Mahadev tribunal that is going on. Fortunately, there is a sizable amount of water that is still left out from that dispute. So I think in that sense, it answers, or it rather takes care of the precautionary principle approach there. But I don't think the Mahadev tribunal arguments have gone in that direction. We are so stuck with my resource versus your resource, and my share versus your share. We forget the larger cause it serves. multi-statally and for the whole country.
Competitive,
And I think
competitive federalism, as you said, not
exactly,
cooperative.
exactly. So I think we have to make that shift quickly before we lose the whole tree, really.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Absolutely, yes. This is also probably part of the number of legal loopholes that we have identified here. I was wondering, Sharat sir, if you could shed a little bit light on the role of the communities in this federal setup, since they are the ones that are directly affected by climate change, but they have virtually no say when it comes to policies. And in your work and your research, you quite often encounter these local communities, let's say in the area of water. And I was wondering if you could shed some light on their role, how they can be or should be involved in this setup, in this federal setup.
Yeah. So, as you know, there's sort of the broad and maybe slightly oversimplified debate in environmental governance, and particularly in the Indian context, has been about centralization versus decentralization. And that's true for the forest sector. We talked about joint forest management. Now we have the community forest resource model from the Forest Rights Act, and so on. It's been true of the water sector. We've talked about participatory irrigation management and decentralized watershed development, all this kind of stuff. So it's a very interesting conundrum, especially in the water sector. I would say the water sector foremost, in the sense of the complexity that it's not easily amenable to this simplified centralized versus decentralized dichotomy. Because if you take it to one extreme, you do decentralized water management, everybody says whatever falls in my watershed is my water, then you would have nothing flowing in the Kaveri, because everybody's claiming their share of those microcatchments of the Kaveri as their water, right? And that would be true of all river basins. That would be true of all aquifers. That if it is, somehow I'm sitting on top of the aquifer, then it's my water. So I think the water sector is a real challenge, because on the one hand, there are good arguments to decentralize vis-a-vis where we are today. Vis-a-vis where we are today, not as an absolute decentralization, but vis-a-vis where we are today. So, for example, the 74th Amendment said that water would be local water supply, domestic water supply, and sewerage is a local subject, which means subject of the city government or that of the gram panchayats and the jilla panchayats, right? Now, the translation of that amendment, which was made 1992, into reality, we are like way behind in terms of translating that. In Bangalore, our activist friends, Leo Saldana and others, had to go to the High Court to get them to implement the idea of ward committees. And even now, the ward committee is still struggling to say, well, what are we actually supposed to do when the amendment says that they are supposed to, for example, manage water supply. Water supply is the role of the urban local body, and within that, the ward committees. Now, if you really implemented that, that would be in many ways a great thing, because you would get local communities to face the reality of the complexity of the water challenge. The wastewater that they produce, the groundwater that they deplete, the imported water that is scarce, and they have to share equitably within the local ward. But we are still struggling trying to figure out how to implement that. The downside of that can, of course, be that now in the context of climate change, what does this local community do? Is it supposed to be less dependent on imported water? Can it demand more imported water because it's going to lose some of its rainfall? So that those inter-regional, negotiations of whose water and how do we share it, they're going to actually intensify, both not just across states, within states. It's going to create more complications as we go along, more demands on the same water. And it was interesting a few years ago when the tribunal award finally came down, it didn't spark anti-Tamil riots in Bangalore. What it sparked was the Mandya farmers who gain irrigation water from the Kaveri doing a roadblock on the Mysore highway because they said Bangalore was taking too much of their water. So it finally brought home the possibility that, well, it's not only trying to blame the other state, it's about also how you have allocated water within your state, which is part of your problem. You've done it very arbitrarily, opaquely, without enough consultation or decentralized discussions. So even though decentralization is not a panacea by any means, and the water sector is a really good example where complete decentralization could also create a lot of problems. But at the same time, I think the idea that we need a more democratic, transparent way of allocating water, incorporating, as Sanjay pointed out, the idea of a precautionary principle in these times of great uncertainty, and not depending only on magic, massive technological solutions like big dams to now also absorb the climate problem in a sense. Is something that we have to really grapple with as we go along. And yeah, I think we have a long way to go before we get there. But there are some small glimmers of hope here and there. I think the courts pushing the idea that you have a 74th amendment, you better implement it, is kind of an interesting entry point into some of that stuff.
I just wanted to add, I don't know if have your permission, Volker, on the if
Please, please.
water and community, the debate on surface water is very different from debate on groundwater, and the regime is very different. When I look at groundwater, it was always about groundwater being private property as a legal framework. So we have moved just in the opposite direction as far as groundwater is concerned, because whoever owned the land owned the water as far as groundwater is concerned, the Easement Act is concerned. But now there's a tendency to sort of centralize that resource. So there is a whole, upside down sort of debate going on that excessive privatization was not good for the country when you look at groundwater, the way it was exploited. So it has to be regulated more. It started with the electricity reforms to now groundwater board, the groundwater authority was created, and now of course the National Green Tribunal, and there's a whole groundwater policy. How do you allocate water right from farmers who use about 90% of that water to domestic use to industry? And the figures are mind boggling. If you talk to an industry, and this is what as a lawyer you feel always to get different perspective, if you talk to the industry, they say that the most regulation on groundwater is on 5% of the industry which uses water. And there is no stick to the 90% misuse of water by farmers, or another maybe not 5%, 80%, 80% or 85% is farmers, about 10% is domestic, and 5% is industry. So when you ask them, they like, why are we being penalized for all the groundwater violations, and why there is no conversation with the farmer, or the way you're farming, or the irrigation technology, and so on and so forth. So I think these debates are slowly becoming more complicated with the impacts of climate again. So that's one. And the other, I think, I in fact wanted Sharad to talk a little more about is on how do we look at this very complicated climate change framework and red framework to the Aam Adivasi out there. I mean, who knows probably more forest than anybody else in the world, but who has to face this very complex language of an international instrument. you know, I mean, they've been doing a lot of things that are far more useful to the forest and the wildlife and the biodiversity and the knowledge they have. But we haven't been able to capture that knowledge and put it into the policy frame. I mean, I remember when we were debating the Forest Rights Act, and the moment you, of course, debate a particular legislation, you are termed as a, anti something else. But be that as it may, that was a great opportunity, I thought, the Forest Rights Act, to resolve a lot of these debates. Because if you look at the way planning is envisaged in that law, one of the key elements of that planning is to look into these sophisticated instruments facilitated by people who understand that language into that planning process. And I think we've sort of missed that opportunity because of this big tussle between departments. I mean, this whole thing about FRA is not mine, and the forest department sort of indifference to that law versus the revenue department, which doesn't really understand that law, versus the tribal department, which doesn't have the capacity to implement that law, versus the Panchayati Raj, which is not really interested in that law at all. And this is for the first time that these four very crucial departments have actually come to the ground level, at the Gram Sabha level, at the village council level, which can actually tease out a lot of these issues. But I think there's a lost opportunity there for some reason. I don't know. What do you think?
Well, I think they offer very interesting contrast, the forest sector and the water sector, in the sense, especially you said on the groundwater side, it's been a vacuum for a long time, and then some very hurriedly passed legislation like the Karnataka Groundwater Regulatory Authority Act of 2011, which is a hollow and completely useless piece of legislation. But for a long time, we have had no legislation at all on groundwater, so it's been a free for all. So the groundwater directorate today in Karnataka, for instance, a state where 50% of the total consumption of water, even in agriculture, is coming from groundwater, mind you. And when it comes to towns and cities, it's a much larger proportion. When it comes to industry, it's a much larger proportion. But uh, even in a state which is so groundwater dependent, the groundwater directorate has a total staff from chaprasi to director of 33 people. So, and then there's the NGT saying you're not doing anything about regulating. Well, how are they going to regulate anything if they've got a total statewide staff of 33 people, right? So that's one extreme where we've got a complete absence of the state, and then some ham-handed measures like the regulatory authority, which today you cannot find any. You can't even find that authority, let alone the minutes of their meetings or anything. They haven't held meetings for 3 years. They're doing nothing on that front, right? And the other extreme is your colonial inheritance in the forest sector and forest governance, where you've got a bureaucracy which is so entrenched and which is not a regulatory bureaucracy by any means. It is the owner, the producer, the manager, the funder, the policy maker. It's everything, because the same IFS officers sit in Delhi and make policy, and the same IFS officers here, they dole out Campa money to their brethren who are implementing plantations, right? So they are the whole and soul in this sector, and it's one sort of monolith in some sense, which is used to 150 years of privilege and control of a very large landscape, refusing to give up that control. And as I said, then you've got a Forest Rights Act which gives the rights to Adivasis or other forest dwellers in these areas, struggling to claim those rights, struggling to get those rights recognized. And the moment, and here's an interesting example from Chhattisgarh, where I think I mentioned earlier that in our earlier conversation that I'm doing some training for Adivasi communities in Chhattisgarh on the community forest rights implementation side. The moment the forest department senses that the political side is pushing for rights recognition of communities, it changes its role from the manager to the regulator and says, "Oh, now how do we know that the communities will not destroy the forest? How will we meet our international commitments on carbon sequestration?" So we need the communities to then draft management plans which look exactly like my working plan. Which meet the national working plan code, which do this, which do that, which have a 30-page preamble and a 20-page appendix, and you know, and it is very scientific. It's of course loaded with scientific forestry, right? Because that's their kind of claim to fame. So you have this very quick turnaround where they're again trying to control what's going on in what might be a decentralizing process by saying that no, we will dictate now what communities shall and shall not do through the instrument of a working plan or through the instrument of a management plan whose guidelines we are going to set. And so we have, I think, these two sectors show some really interesting, and in both contexts, really climate change is just nowhere in the picture. Good resource management itself is not happening, right? So I think it shows that neither a heavily centralized or overbearing state, nor a state which abandons its responsibilities and allows a free for all, are really our solutions in this context. And you need a much more nuanced, multi-layered, engaged approach from the state. There were some interesting propositions in the model groundwater bill that the Planning Commission floated in 2012. You will remember that. And one may want to improve upon it or modify it in so many different ways, but that was an attempt to start a conversation towards a more comprehensive regulation of groundwater, but in a way which was again multi-layered, not only one groundwater authority sitting in Bangalore and trying to set permits for the whole state of Bangalore. I mean, so whole state of Karnataka, right? So I think that's the kind of nuance that we are missing. And when the state abdicates its responsibility to produce nuanced legislation and nuanced administration, you have ham-handed stepping in of the courts. And I think the courts, with all due respect, the courts by definition are going to be ham-handed because their attention span, the kind of expertise that they might have in any subject is going to be very limited. And so they're going to kind of jump in and say, oh my God, groundwater is being overexploited. Now from tomorrow, the states must do this, do that, do that, without understanding any of the nuances. And the private sector might very well be right, or the industrial sector, that we are over-regulated as compared to the 95% who are having a free-for-all. Uh, so I think that's a symptom of the kind of vacuum that's been left in that space. And on the forest side, I think it's an overcrowding of the bureaucratic sort of control for the last 150 years, not willing to let go.
Yeah, I would like you to take you up right there. Dr. Lele is arguing for a more comprehensive and nuanced approach, and Sanjay Upadhyay has been demanding legally binding a framework instead of the action plans of the nation or the state action plans that we're having, or these working papers. Now, when we combine those two, since we're slowly moving now in the Q&A session, I was wondering how this can be enforced. This was one of the questions that was being asked. So let's say we have a nuanced approach, and we have laws in place that make the national action plan and/or the state action plans on climate change legally binding. And those are good plans. I've seen 3 of them so far, the national one and 2 of the state ones. They're good, but yes, the problem is they're not legally binding. But once they're legally binding, how can you enforce them? Because this is another problem altogether. I would be asking you, Sanjay Upadhyay, how can they be made enforceable, through which existing laws? And I would also ask everyone to please ask questions on YouTube or Facebook.
So one thing that I have realized over the years, 27 years of lawyering, is that we end up trying to make that perfect law, or we make it so utopian that it is not implementable. And I think this is where I think what Sharad, if I've understood him correctly, is talking about, that we have to have a nuanced approach to lawmaking itself, which is doable, practicable, given a reality. I mean, I know that half the ministry is writing parawise reply to either Supreme Court or High Court or the National Green Tribunal when I talk to my officers' friends. So, when do you get the time to do that environmental governance thinking or implementation challenges? So I think if you make your instrument too complicated or too utopian, then you end up making a law or a court order completely unimplementable. But if you make it a little more nuanced in the sense that it is practicable, it is doable, then obviously, I'll just give you a very different example. In Delhi, 3,000 brick kilns have been stopped by a stroke of a pen because they add to ambient air quality. They worsen the ambient air quality standards. Their contributory pollution is less than 3%, as per 5 studies of IITs and everything. So when they go to the court and they say, I'm only contributing 3%, why have you closed my entire industry? The answer is precautionary principle. You have added to the air quality standards. We are breathing poison. Therefore, so there are 3,000 into about 10,000 crores. That's the calculation of money that they pump into the farming sector, because a lot of farmers in their part-time are involved in brick kilns, for example, red bricks I'm talking about. And suddenly they are jobless. In fact, MHA had to intervene to give a circular that you better run your brick kilns, because otherwise people are going to migrate in the COVID times. And they were forced to start the brick kilns and keep all these migrant laborers within the brick kilns. NGT, of course, is completely oblivious of that they are actually violating their order, and they're actually, running the show despite a ban. I mean, these kind of complexities that you see, and if you take it very simply and say you're adding to the capacity, so there's a big debate about carrying capacity today. And this is perhaps the most misused word or misunderstood word in my understanding so far, because we still don't know how many, let's say in this case, how many brick kilns can you actually have in a city or in the NCR region, or how many vehicles are supposed to ply on the roads, uh, how many, and there's how many thermal plants can you have, how many coastal infrastructure can you put in a coastal area, and you can go on and on and on. I think somewhere we have to really debate on how much and where to stop. And I think this is where our legislations have completely failed. Because if you look at standards, for example, again, since I'm on the brick kiln, the standard is 750 microgram of emission that they can have. And there's a proposed legislation of 250 microgram. So they say that, you please come and examine all of us. If we are less than 250 also, which is your proposed legislation, where do you have the right to shut me off? That's a valid question they ask. So I think what we have done is, if you look at the EIA notification or your CRZ notification, I mean, who understands a 51 times amended legislation with 385 office memos to clarify that particular EIA notification? Or that 200 odd OMs that have clarified the 4-page Forest Conservation Act. I mean, if you look at these instruments, we have it's a maze for a lawyer, of course, because you actually can see the trend of how governments think, and it's a fascinating exercise. Anybody is interested, I'll give them those notifications. Similarly, if you look at the forestry case in Supreme Court since 1995, there are some 1,000 orders, some 4,000 intervention applications. And if you just see the trend of how judiciary thinks, it's mind boggling, because every judge has his own take about every issue, and nobody wants to get into a judicial history or a historical sort of evolution of how that instrument has evolved. So, I mean, to cut the long story short, we need to make legislations which are doable. Only then it will be implementable, and only then court orders sort of add strength to it. Otherwise, it will never be implementable. We can keep giving orders, and there are fancy orders every day. It's never going to see the light of the day.
So if I could also respond to the sort of very specific question that Sandeep Dubey asked about the fact that if the international commitments are intended and not really binding commitments, then how do we make them locally binding? My response, actually, as I said earlier, also is that I don't want to see, and I think it's legally probably problematic, but it's also practically and politically a bad idea to say that intended commitments made internationally should somehow become binding here, especially since they are commitments about mitigation. They're not commitments about adaptation. And by all international standards, India is a has low responsibility for climate change. Therefore, any mitigation commitments that it has made are more than sufficient from an international perspective. And making more and more stringent commitments towards mitigation is not going to help the Indian at all. I mean, let's take the most drastic scenario. India emits today about 6% of, annually, 6% of annual global CO2 emissions come from India. Now, if we do a thought experiment saying, oh, we are responsible for 6% of GHG emissions, let's shut them off completely. Like the most draconian commitment that you can make maybe is go to zero emissions overnight. But it's going to make no difference. Your Himalayan glaciers are still going to melt. Your rivers are still going to go haywire. With things, Bangalore is still going to face the kind of flooding it is facing in the last few years because of crazy rainfall. All the climate change impacts that you're seeing today will continue tomorrow and for the next umpteen decades, because you still only knocked out 5% of total emissions. You hardly made a dent in the whole story. Not to mention the historical emissions to which you hardly contributed. So I think if we are talking about anything that is legally binding on the state, it's the state's duty to protect the individual citizen from the impacts of a crisis that it is really not within its power to control. And in that sense, it is about life, liberty, and clean environment, Article 21, however you interpret it, that the state must make enough efforts to protect the citizens life, liberty, and environment. In that sense, from the clearly palpable impacts of climate change. And so I'm saying the state's responsibility to its citizens is primarily on the adaptation side. At the same time, there is a lot of stuff that where we see an interplay between carbon CO2 mitigation and other environmental problems. And air pollution is a classic example where you would want to take up mitigation of, let's say, cars in the in the Delhi National Capital Region, a reduction in cars, not because you have a CO2 commitment internationally, but you have an air pollution commitment locally. And the first thing you should be cutting down is cars or thermal power plants, and much lower down the list would be brick kilns and stuff like that. So I think uh, there are places where local environmental commitments, you might say, to control environmental harm overlap with CO2 emissions, where you can look for a win-win. But the courts need to keep holding the state to local environmental concerns, of which climate is very much so in terms of its impacts, and therefore the need to reduce people's vulnerability, whether it's coastal people, Himalayan people, Deccan Plateau, wherever, everywhere. And that the state it would be hard pressed to say that it's doing a great job on that front. So I would not look for enforcement of those NDCs which are about mitigation. I'd look for enforcement of those local commitments that already exist about air pollution or anything else, which overlap perhaps with those NDCs, and primarily on the
Actually, that's
adaptation.
what I meant, Sharad. I mean, you are absolutely bang on that. I mean, I also meant that we are talking about bottom up here. We are talking about compliances at the local level, which you can then extrapolate to your commitments.
Right.
In that sense, they need to merge together, and I take that point completely. I'm not saying that there is a federal structure which comes on top, and then we are sort of trickling down to that last mile and making it implementable just because there's an NDC or a Paris Agreement commitment. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that the strengthening of your local systems will anyway reflect on your commitments outside. And I think that marriage is very important. I think that's the point, as Mr. Shahid is saying.
Exactly, and you had also argued for implementation of doable practices, or those are the ones that are most likely to be enforced and enforceable. And both of you are arguing or are in favor of local approaches. So this was asked by a number of people, as was also prominently shown on screen right now. So how would a policy look like if we were to take the bottom-up approach into concern? You both have mentioned that it's the local communities that know the forest the best, that are affected by the water problems the most. So, but how can we create a certain governance structures which is working bottom-up?
I mean, I think I think one of those questions actually came from somebody from Arunachal, perhaps. It's kind of a real paradox.
No, that's his name. That's Mr. Agastya Arunachal.
I'm wondering whether it reflects the place where the person is coming from. Maybe not. Sorry if I've jumped to a conclusion. But Arunachal Pradesh does offer an interesting paradox. The Northeast as a whole does offer an interesting paradox where, on the one hand, you have a fair bit of devolution of rights over the forest. And communities have a huge autonomy in the way they manage the forest. And at the same time, it seems like when it comes to building a huge dam in Arunachal, whether it is Dibang or Rihand or 15 other dams that are planned, the local communities have no voice whatsoever in terms of what forest is going to be submerged, and it's all their forest, but they don't seem to have any voice in whether or not the dam should be built at the particular size and shape that it's being planned to. And the interesting thing is that the Forest Rights Act, which has not been implemented in most northeastern states because they felt that they already had autonomy, autonomous control over forests, suddenly becomes an important instrument because it offers you, for the first time, a say in the diversion of forest to non-forest activities, which the other laws are somehow not being allowed to have a say in, right? So I think there's the question about how do we build up bottom-up processes. There are good examples in the Northeast of having some autonomy, And there are good examples in the Forest Rights Act of attempting to bring in that kind of bottom-up process in forest governance, but a long way to go in terms of the implementation of the Forest Rights Act, for example. And in the Northeast, I think it is more about having that autonomy, but not being able to do a more nuanced approach to using that autonomy and retaining that autonomy in the face of massive development projects that are being planned in the Northeast. So I think that's the catch in the Northeast. In the country as a whole, I think the Forest Rights Act implementation is a template that could be used for a bottom-up approach to forest governance, but yet to be implemented. And as we discussed in the water sector, we are still far from having even an FRA type act being passed. Which lays out what is that multi-layered governance for water from the individual farmer up to, let's say, a river basin. What might be some structure that we could adopt? We're still very far away from doing that. But there are possibilities that, in the law, in the administrative framework, in the funding, there are many spaces in which one could do some amount of bottom-up thinking.
In fact, I remember there was a similar attempt as FRA for the coastal communities of fisher folks as well. And there's a bill that was lying for a long time in 2011, I remember, but that is somehow not being discussed anymore. Where similar rights, again, bottom-up approach was talked about for coastal communities. I think one space that I wanted to sort of flag is when you talk about bottom-up approach, is how do you view your public consultation processes? I mean, any number of hydropower projects or any large infrastructure project, the way you look at your public consultation process or the way it is designed today, I think that is where the biggest problem is. Because, you look at any public hearing minutes, you'll always see 90% of them saying, oh, we want it, and it is good for us because there is a community hall being done, there's some hospital being created, there's a little road being built. And so the debate ends there, between facilities, as if the state was never intended to provide those facilities, which was their actual job. It was not for a project proponent to provide you roads or a community hall or a little hospital. But somehow the debates in these public consultations, at least in the written part, I see mostly about these little community aspirations. And it's never about what is really good for them or bad for them. And this is where I think we've lost the plot. Because if you look at public consultations, it is divided into information and then the processing of that information and a perception that is created out of that information. I think the first point of what information you provide is the biggest hurdle. Because what you provide, or at least what you're legally supposed to provide, is a summary of a little project. Now, a summary of a project with a little rapid EIA document of a 30-page can never tell you the real impact or the potential impact of a project. And Arunachal is not just 10, 15, Sharad, there are 120 dams being planned. In fact, when we went on this whole topic about cumulative impact assessment, that, you may be having 50,000 megawatt potential, but who's going to decide 120 dams and why? And is that required at all? But then all we understood was that it is all about that dam into that little royalty that we get and the matter ends. And those 90% of those projects probably will never see the light of the day. But then you've got that little royalty money and you're happy with it. And therefore, this whole basin approach and the cumulative impact of the basin approach is not even being looked at. I mean, it's high time we have CIAs, it's high time we have strategic environment assessments, it's high time we have social impact assessments for these kind of projects. But I don't think that's even debated much in a forum that we have. I mean, I remember arguing this CIA, and the first question that I was confronted with was, where is it in the law? At best, you can have a little basin study, but then which basin? Are you talking about that whole catchment or that big bend, or so it's a very complicated debate, and I think unless we have these things teased out at the bottom level of what is the real information you have to give, what is mandatory for you to give, those debates will never reach the right conclusions, in my understanding.
We're moving on to the final stretch of our event. I think there are no verbal questions, right, Sabia? No spoken.
No, but well, if you permit me, Volker, I have one.
Yes, please, of course.
But I couldn't but help. I can't but help use this opportunity to ask you both. Um One thing that's come out very clearly in this discussion today is that we are straddled with contradictions in this entire in this entire narrative, right? I mean, there are so many contradictions: centralization versus non-centralization, uh, competitive federalism versus um, cooperative federalism. The role of the community versus the role of government. Uh, and there's a question out there which is about the role of education, public education. There has to be much more communication of ideas. And Sanjay pointed out in the legal system, uh, just the legal process itself and how the judiciary is just looking at it or equipped to look at it. Uh, uh, Against all of this, if I had to ask you, could you suggest one kind of a thread um, from your respective perspectives on the way forward, so that some kind of a synergy can evolve in this process? Obviously, it's an extremely complicated issue. We can't address everything, but sometimes you can pull out something which has worked in maybe other parts or is working here and can be replicated. Would you? Is there anything that you can comment on that?
Well, I'm going to stray into Sanjay's domain by saying that uh, very small things with the state that needs to do and is not doing is things like, the judicial space is not just a space for some expert judges to lay down the law or to interpret the law. It's also a place for debate, dialogue, and opening up of issues, and for public education in that sense. When people read judgments or read the debates, that's part of an educational process. And if that is to happen on some of these complicated issues, you would need the time and the space and the resources that are currently simply unavailable. Of the 20
Mm.
benches that the National Green Tribunal is supposed to be operating, I think the current number is 6 or 8 or something. There's just one small example of the complete, shall we say, irresponsible decimation of the judicial space or choking of the judicial space by the state, the choking of civil society space by various ways in which even debates and process and protests and so on. These are all parts of uh, educating ourselves in a democratic country. If I operate on the basis of saying that I know everything, then then we might as well go to a dictatorship. So I think we need those spaces in hugely greater numbers than we have today. And we need state support for civil society work, not the other way around. Looking at civil society as a troublemaker, as a something to be muzzled and kept quiet and so on. So I think that's the one thing I would say, that everywhere the state needs to support places of debate, dialogue, contestation, and not the other way around.
If I have to respond, I'm reminded of a webinar that happened on 10 years of NGT recently, where the chairperson came and said very frankly and candidly that 90% of the cases is only about improving governance. So it is nothing to do with adjudication. It's about waste somewhere and solid waste somewhere and pollution somewhere. So basically, it's 90% of governance failure and 10% of adjudication. So if you look at the volumes here, and of course, you're absolutely right. In a huge country like India, where there is one forum functioning, there were supposed to be 5 benches with 10 judges and 10 experts. Today, only 2 forums are working, and other 3 come through video conferencing, which are completely overstretched. They get hardly 1 hour, 2 hours to sort of do the cases of the entire region. So that's a complete failure of and a mockery of the system that we created, so with so much of difficulty in the beginning. So that is one reality that you have to face. That 90% of the time we are talking about failure of governance itself. You know, but how do you what is that one thing that you can pull out? I think one thing that I can pull out is, and that is the biggest test for me, is that any instrument that is being thought through, and this is a great time where every instrument is being thought through again with the new dispensation. I think the bottom line principle is it has to follow the test of what I call as non-regression principle, and this is now debated a lot in the Western world, in the European academia, that non-regression principle is something that has to be a test. No instrument can go back and make the environmental frame worse than the current one. So this was actually argued in one of the cases of Spen Bio, and fortunately, it finds itself in a judgment, which has again been appealed in the Supreme Court. So that is one thing that I wanted to communicate. The other is what Sharad mentioned very interestingly, is where are those spaces to debate this? And in the formal system, and I've been talking to some government officials about setting up what I call as PUNK, Policy Analysis and Knowledge Hub, and that should be attached to every decision making body, which is absolutely nothing to do with the system as a whole, but they are independent thinkers, of the nation, people from different disciplines, because often we get so watertight in our own discipline. And if you talk to a lawyer, he's so sort of blinkered with the legal approaches. If you talk to an economist, they are so blinkered with the numbers. If you talk to a sociologist or a political science student, but I think we have to get all these people in the same space, and I think they need to also be told about the problems that are facing that particular nation or that particular department or that ministry. And if they can then come up with that independent thought on what the problem is and what the possible solution can be, I think there is much to I think there is a huge possibility there for solutions, real solutions, because today the decision making process is so geared towards their own top down sort of, if I have to know about a problem, I have to ask my forest DFO, and then he asks the ranger, and then who in turn asks the forest guard. It's so sort of regimented that you lose the larger picture and the bigger picture. I think that punk element has to be there right from the ministerial level to perhaps the gram sachivalaya, if we can have it at the end, to get that alternative sort of narrative to resolving that problem. Maybe that's the solution. I don't know. Maybe I'm dreaming.
Right. I think we are sort of coming towards the end. We're running out of time, but Volker, would I? But I think thank you very much, because in Asian Confluence we've coined a phrase called the third space, which means thinkers or people who are can people from government, academia, civil society, business, industry, community can come together sort of in a relaxed frame of space to kind of uh, break these silos of disciplines and kind of churn a bit on these very complicated ideas. And I think this idea of the punk that you just spoke of is really great. And what Dr. Lele said about more space uh, to churning of ideas, and in the often civil society, I think, is looked at as opposing government. But I think if we can come to somewhere where it is can work together and churn on ideas, not just as a protest mechanism, but also as an ideating mechanism to come up with solutions. I think that would be also a way forward. And perhaps such conversations that we just had, the intention is also to spur thought in towards that end. And the fact that both of you coming from two varied disciplines, but working together, sharing your perspectives. That's basically, I think, brings home the point that of the importance of such conversations. And we were joined today. I also want to not only thank our speakers and the collaboration with Hans Seidel Foundation and Volker for this wonderful conversation that we just were witness to. But also we were joined by people from a lot of places within India, but also across the borders in Bangladesh and Myanmar. There was somebody from Malaysia, and so these conversations often spur thought beyond borders, and show how much connected we are. And we do hope, both at Asian Confluence and I'm sure Volker, I speak for Hans Seidel Foundation too, when we say that we want to take this forward, these conversations forward. In fact, I must share that we will have one more in this series where we will have sharings on best practices from Europe in the field of regional cooperation around waters. And I think the idea is, again, to kind of spur thought, think out of the box, or even just give trigger points to discuss new ideas. We may not come up with solutions, but we can definitely generate trigger points for further discussion, breaking the boundaries of the various silos that we all have to operate in for our own various fields of the work that we are involved in. But on that note, a very big thank you to you, Dr. Lele, for joining us, to Sanjay, Mr. Sanjay Upadhyay, for joining us, Volker for moderating the discussion, and to all our viewers and those who will watch it in the days to come. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for the opportunity.
And of course, thanks to our friends from Asian Confluence. Thank you to our speakers. I think
Alak and everybody else, Sandeep, and
exactly.
All
Yeah, that was great.
Thank you. Thank you.
Perfect. Yeah, I enjoyed every single minute of it. So